He slid the papers across the table, didn't look at me when he did it, just pushed them forward with 2 fingers like they were a receipt he was done with. "Sign it," he said. "We're done." I looked at the papers, then I looked at him, and I did something he had never, not once in 3 years, seen me do. I picked up the pen, and I signed. He froze, just for a second, but I saw it. The pen was still in my hand, the ink was still wet on the page, and Seo-jun, the most feared man in Seoul, the man whose name made other powerful men lower their voices, was staring at me like I'd just pulled the floor out from under him. Because I had. He'd done this before. 3 times in 3 years. The papers, the ultimatum, the cold voice, and the colder eyes. Every time I'd cried, begged, asked him what I did wrong, every time he'd put the papers away, pulled me close, called it a test, said I proved myself. I used to believe that. I used to think love looked like surviving someone's tests. Not anymore. Let me tell you who I am. My name is Amara, 26, from Atlanta. Came to Seoul on a 1-year work visa and ended up staying for 3 years because of a man I had no business falling for. I was a waitress at a private club in Gangnam when I met him, Seo-jun, 34, quiet in the way that dangerous things are quiet. He came in every Thursday, same table, same order. He watched me for 4 Thursdays before he said a word. On the 5th, he said, "Have dinner with me." I said no. He came back the next Thursday and asked again. I said no. He kept asking. For almost 4 months he kept asking. 100 times. I counted. Because every time he asked, something in me kept track, kept score, filed it away under things that mattered. I didn't understand back then that persistence isn't always love. Sometimes it's just a man who doesn't like being told no. The night I finally said yes, he took me to a restaurant where the menu had no prices. He ordered for both of us without asking what I wanted. I noticed that. But his eyes were on me the whole night, like I was the only thing in the room worth looking at. And I forgot about the menu. That was my first mistake. We were together for 3 years after that. And somewhere in year 2, I realized something. The man who had asked me 100 times, who had been so patient, so persistent, so certain he wanted me, had stopped showing up. Not physically. He was there. In the penthouse, in the car, in the bed. But he was gone in every way that mattered. Cold when I needed warmth. Absent when I needed presence. Critical when I needed someone in my corner. And every time I asked what was wrong, every time I tried to close the distance, he'd pull out the papers. Sign. We're done. And every time, I'd fall apart. Every time, he'd watch me fall apart. And then, he'd put the papers away. That was the control. That was always the control. The last time he did it, I was ready. Not because I'd planned it, because I was simply too tired to feel anything else. I'd been up since 4 in the morning. I'd worked a double. I'd come home to a cold apartment and a man sitting at the dining table in the dark like he was waiting for a verdict. The papers were already out. He'd already made himself comfortable in his cruelty. He said, "I've been thinking, this isn't working." I set my bag down. He said, "You know what to do." I looked at him, and I realized I didn't feel the panic, not even a flicker. I felt something else, something very close to relief. If someone ever used your love against you, subscribe, because this story is for you. I pulled out the chair across from him, sat down, looked at the papers. 3 years. Everything we'd been through. Everything I'd cried over and fought for and shrunk myself to hold on to. All of it sitting in a 2-page document in the low light of our dining room. I picked up the pen from the table. He said, "Amara." I signed the first page. He went very still. I signed the second page, put the pen down, pushed the papers back across the table, and stood up. He said, "What are you doing?" I said, "What you asked me to do." He looked at the papers, then he looked at me, and I watched it happen. The crack. Not dramatic, not loud, just a small, quiet fracture in the control he'd spent years perfecting. He said, "I didn't think you'd actually—" I said, "I know." I picked up my bag, walked to the bedroom, started packing. He followed me. He stood in the doorway watching me open the closet, pull out my things, lay them flat in the suitcase with the careful, methodical movement of someone who had already made peace with what they were doing. He said, "Stop." I kept packing. He said, "Amara," I said, "Stop." I folded a shirt. He came into the room. He said, "This is not what I meant." I said, "Then you should have been clearer." He said, "I was frustrated. I needed you to." I said, "What? Cry? Beg? Tell you not to go?" He didn't answer. I zipped the suitcase. I said, "Seo-jun, I have done that 3 times. 3 times I fell apart so you could feel powerful enough to put the papers away and pull me back. I'm not doing it a 4th time." He said, "That's not what that was." I said, "Then what was it?" Silence. I said, "That's what I thought." I lifted the suitcase off the bed. He grabbed my arm. Not hard, not threatening, like someone grabbing a door that's closing. He said, "Where are you going?" I said, "Somewhere you don't have papers." I stayed with my friend Yuna for 3 days. I didn't cry. I want to say that again because it surprised me too. I didn't cry, I slept, I ate, I sat by her window and looked at Seoul at night and felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Like myself. Like the Amara who had existed before she'd spent 3 years bending around a man who didn't know what to do with someone who loved him fully. On day 2, Seo-jun called. I didn't answer. He called 11 more times. I didn't answer. On day 3, a message came through Yuna's building concierge. A handwritten note. I knew his handwriting. It said, "I made a mistake. Please come home." I folded it, put it in my bag, didn't respond. Comment below. Would you have answered? What would you have done? Tell me. On day 5, he showed up at the restaurant where I'd gone back to work, not the club in Gangnam. A smaller place a friend managed, where I'd picked up shifts just to stay busy, just to have somewhere to be that wasn't inside my own head. He walked in at 7 p.m. during the dinner rush. Suit, no tie. The first time I'd ever seen him without a tie. Something about that detail hit me harder than I expected. He looked around the room until he found me. He didn't approach immediately. He sat at the bar, ordered water, waited. When I came over to refill glasses at the table nearest him, he said quietly, "Can I talk to you?" I said, "I'm working." He said, "I'll wait." I looked at him. This man, this powerful, controlled, dangerous man who had pulled out papers 3 times like they were a weapon, who had watched me cry and called it a test, who had always assumed that I would stay because I always had, sitting at a bar with a glass of water, no guards, no posture, no armor, just waiting. I said, "I get off at 10. He said, "I'll be here." He was there at 10. We sat outside on the steps behind the restaurant, not romantic, not cinematic, just 2 people in the cold, both too tired to pretend. He talked for a long time. He said things I hadn't heard him say before about his father, about the way he'd grown up watching his parents weaponize their leaving, the way walking out had always been the move that won, in his house, the way he'd learned that love was something you controlled by threatening to take it away. He said, "I never thought you'd actually go." I said, "That's the problem." He said, "I know." I said, "You asked me 100 times, Seo-jun. 100 times before I said yes. And then the moment you had me, you started treating me like I had nowhere else to go." He looked at the ground. I said, "I always had somewhere else to go. I just chose you. Every day, I chose you. And you never understood that choosing is something you have to keep earning." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Is it too late?" I looked at him. And here's the thing nobody tells you about being strong enough to leave. It doesn't make you love them less. It doesn't fix everything in 5 minutes of honesty on a cold set of stairs behind a restaurant in Seoul. It just means you finally know your own worth well enough to require someone else to know it too. I said, I don't know yet. He said, what do I have to do? I said, stop practicing for the moment I leave. Start showing up for the time I stay. He nodded, didn't say anything else. We sat there for a while longer. Seoul was loud around us. Traffic, voices, the city doing what cities do. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if he's capable of being different. If what he learned in that cold house with those cold parents is something a person can actually unlearn. Or whether people are mostly what they've been made into and the best you can do is witness it clearly. But I know what I learned. I learned that the most powerful thing I ever did was pick up that pen. Not to hurt him. Not for revenge. Just to finally choose myself as loudly as I'd spent 3 years choosing him. And the moment I did, the moment he saw that I was actually, genuinely, completely okay with leaving, everything that he'd built his control around collapsed. Because control only works on someone who is afraid to go. And I wasn't afraid anymore. He asked 100 times, and she said no. Because she knew she was worth the wait. The one time she said yes, she meant it. And the one time she signed, she meant that too. If you've ever loved someone so hard, you forgot you were allowed to leave, this one is for you. Subscribe. New story every week. Built for everyone who's ever been underestimated by someone they loved. Drop your city below. I want to know where you're watching from. And tell me, would you have signed? Would you have stayed? Would you have answered the phone? Comment below. Let's talk about it.